All right, so we shall start. Welcome to the Xylem's first ever news event. Our news event is Protest as a Science, How Americans Are Responding to Trump 2.0. It is a pleasure to have everyone here. My name is Alex. I am the publisher and editor of the Xylem, and I am based in Atlanta in the United States. So the Xylem, our mission is to grow healthy and interconnected communities across the world. We are a nonprofit news outlet, and specifically, we are the only Asian American run news outlet that is dedicated to science, climate, and environmental coverage. Our vision is to leverage our lived experiences to become your most trusted resource on environmental health impacts and democracy. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, talk a little bit about who you are, where you're coming from, how you heard about this event. You can take this time to, get to know one another in the messages. So I'll first give an overview of how this news event will go. We'll briefly talk about why the Xylem covers protest, how we do a cover protest that is different from traditional ways, traditional and legacy news media have been covering protests. We'll reveal some of our first unofficial estimates of Labor Day protests across the US. And I'll also offer some observations in terms of sight and sounds, as I've been covering protests on the ground, offer some trends and outliers that you can take a look in your own communities, or journalists can go further investigate in your community. After we complete all of these, we will offer a question and answer session where you can put in questions through the chat or through the dedicated Q&A section that is in this meeting room. All right, so why does the Xylem cover protests? So the Xylem, as we just mentioned, we are specialized news outlet that covers environmental health impacts and democracy. And in the second Trump administration, environmental health policy and democracy are under attack. I live in Atlanta myself, and earlier in the month, there was a shooting at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a little bit outside Atlanta, where a gunman fired over 500 shots towards the CDC building and killed an active duty police officer. So this is reporting from one of our peer newsrooms, Health Beat, and describing how this is a crisis at the CDC. So the Xylem is responding to the Trump administration's assault on evidence-based policy, on public health, on climate change, on environmental regulation, and also on democracy. And one of the ways we realize that people are responding is by showing up on the streets. When residents are showing up on the streets, this is because they realized they wanted to show political pressure towards their elected officials at various levels, whether it's the federal level, whether it's the state level, the local level. And it's also because they don't really have another way of, expressing their anger, their disappointment, and their energy that's been built up. The legal system has been radically different compared to just a year ago. And so are academics or government workers who used to have stable jobs, but increasingly find themselves on slipping ground. Another thing why the Xylem we cover protests is because there is a growing body of research, as shown as in this headline by GRIS, one of our publishing partners, that climate protests or any kind of protests actually make some societal change. The Xylem's goal is to cover actionable information that people can use to make a difference in their community. And protest has been a way to persuade people, change people how they vote, and also to raise attention towards certain issues that are of importance. There is growing academic discussion of the 3% rule, which is basically when a good chunk of society works towards around 3 and 3.5% of the people works towards a specific cause, you achieve the necessary amount of people to push forward social change. And at the Xylem, we are very interested in being a witness to what kinds of social changes are occurring in the second Trump administration, especially among the most vulnerable groups that we serve. And finally, the Xylem covers protests for a practical reason, because national coverage has been lacking. So this is a screenshot of the New York Times and the Washington Post on Monday afternoon. This is on September 1st, so well after most protests on the East Coast on Labor Day have concluded. However, as you can see from these screenshots, there wasn't any reporting about the Labor Day protests or any kind of protests. There was an op-ed about how labor hasn't done enough, while there wasn't coverage about the tens and hundreds of thousands of people that were attending various protests across the US, which I will get to very shortly. As a result, it was important for the Xylem to reflect this reality by covering who are the people who shows up to protest, why are they showing up, and what does that mean for health policy, for environmental policy, for democracy moving forward. I was told by an editor at the Washington Post that the Washington Post did put an article later in the day, but it was buried under 8 different op-eds and 10 different articles after it was published on the Washington Post website. For the Xylem, we believe that when hundreds of thousands of people attend an event, it is a newsworthy event, and that's why we dedicate our time, even through a national holiday, to offer coverage that is unbiased and also that is accurate to make sure people have a sense of what's going on in their own communities. So now I'll talk a little bit about how the Xylem covers protests, right? The Xylem is a very small nonprofit news outlet. We are supported by reader revenue, and we're supported by grants. We currently have 4 members on our staff. I am one of 2 people who are full-time. As a result, we have to learn how to pick and choose our battles. This is a similar occurrence happening across newsrooms across the US, where there's a lot of job cuts and a lot of news outlets no longer have the same manpower to cover events in their communities or across a broader area or for a specific type of story as they used to. As a result, here are some guiding principles of how we cover protests. The first way that we cover protests is to combine it with our regular coverage, as in specifically looking out for why people are protesting. I'm comparing that to our existing coverage. So Trevor Adams is an Emory University postdoc researcher who studies HIV. In March, we covered a protest, Stand Up for Science, which was a nationwide protest. And I asked him, so why did you show up for a protest today? And Trevor told the Xylem that he was very concerned that, infectious diseases are not treated as something that affects everyone in the world, and especially different groups of various racial and ethnic backgrounds. We followed up on his quote to us in July when we had a reporter that is based in South Africa go to Zimbabwe and report about how now HIV medication and HIV curbing efforts in various parts of Africa are at risk. In this case in particular, because USA no longer supports Zimbabwe and giving life-saving HIV medication, there's a growing black market in Zimbabwe where only sex workers are able to afford buying HIV medication that can prevent them from various diseases, while public sector employees such as nurses are actively participating in such black market because they don't make enough to make ends meet. We specifically, when we cover these protests, we listen to what protesters are saying, and we try to verify what they say through extended coverage across the world, and that is cross-border. This is one way we can cover protests and make sure that we follow up with what people say, and we actually track whether their fears are being realized or whether, they have changed their minds over time. Another way that the Xylem covers protests is to have a sense of what elected officials and decision makers across different levels of the U.S., whether from a federal level, a state level, or a local level are responding to recent events and whether they are committing to certain actions that are related to environmental health policy. So Georgia Senator Jason Estefes is one of the candidates running in the Democratic primary in our state for governor. And in an interview with the Xylem this August, so a couple weeks ago, he told us that he needs other state leaders like himself to stand up and fight for public health workers and to protect them from what he describes as nothing short of domestic terrorism. It is important for the Xylem to cover protests and to make public officials or to make leaders go on the record and state their views about why they are at protesting, what are the demands, and how do they plan to achieve it, whether through the ballot box, whether through legal means, whether through other ways that makes readers clearly understand their positions. It is important for us to not just cover grassroots attendees of the protest, which do form the bulk of the people attending such protests, but to understand who are the people who can actually make a difference and to track whether they're present or not present in these protests and to see whether the composition of these decision makers have changed over time, or whether some of the people who've been leading and organizing protests decide to run for public office or decide to try different ways to exercise their power or to exercise, their voice. We do a lot of coverage in the Xylem with photography because a lot of our reporting is visually based. When we talk about protests, it is easy to describe that, oh, a lot of people showed up for a protest today, or dozens of people, hundreds of people. It is important for us to take visual documentation of what people are there to protest about. The Xylem is as a nonprofit news outlet. We welcome various groups, news outlets to republish our work and also obtain the rights to use our photography. And we wanted to show the breadth and depth of the people who are showing up in protests across the US. So this is a photo outside of Midtown Atlanta where a protester is holding up a vaccine shots, not gunshots sign. And the context behind this is because in the same week where there was the CDC shooting, the Secretary for Human and Health Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., also announced that, they're going to change how COVID vaccine shots are going to be approved. And as of right now, in a dozen of states, you are not able to receive the newest updated COVID vaccines at CVS or Walgreens or other locations. And there are still issues with people getting their insurance to cover COVID vaccines. We know this is changing because as of this morning, a number of Western states like California, Oregon, and Washington are moving forward with establishing their own standards of recommendation for vaccines. But it's important to capture this moment in time to understand what people are fighting for. This is important as for, we're creating the first draft of history and we understand this is our duty. And finally, a lot of people ask us, why are you covering a Labor Day protest? Because isn't a Labor Day protest a labor issue, but less so a science or environmental health issue? To that, I point to reporting by the New York Times this Monday. And the New York Times reported that 9 agencies have already terminated union contracts to cover federal workers across the US. And out of the 9 agencies, 4 of them have something to do with environmental health policy. So there is the EPA, there is FEMA, which, at the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, it is important to recognize their work. The Departments of Health and Human Services, and also the Department of Agriculture. So what we are seeing right now is that in Labor Day's context, the specific groups that are most affected by the Trump administration's changes towards labor relations also happen to be people who can make a difference within the federal government in terms of environmental health regulation, environmental health monitoring, environmental health policy, and also environmental health research. So it is particularly important for us to recognize that the Trump administration is specifically targeting these workers for the work that they do that makes it impossible for them to have collective bargaining power. And that's why it is important for us to go cover the people who are protesting on Labor Day. And we have to pick and choose our battles as a very small news outlet to cover specific types of protests. So in my case, for example, I covered the Stand Up for Science protest in person. I also covered the Sound Science Saves Lives protest in person. In terms of No King's Day and also for Labor Day, I contributed virtually by gathering data across the country, but I did not directly cover it myself. And the Xylem's newsroom policy is that our reporters do not attend any public rallies or protests unless we are assigned to cover it. So this is our commitment to you that we try our best to cover any kind of protest where we can see a clear angle with stakes in the environmental, health, and democracy spheres. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we are doing this over Labor Day. So for the Xylem, because of the lack of national coverage at the time we began covering Labor Day protests, and specifically because of the number of protests that are going on, it was important for us to have a sense of how many people are showing up and where they're showing up and the ways they are expressing themselves. And in this case, we are using a methodology first developed by Elliott Morris. He is formerly one of the person running 538, and now he runs his own newsletter called Strength in Numbers. He developed a methodology that was first used in No King's Day, which was this June, to have an unofficial estimate of people who have attended protests across No King's Day. And he has generously allowed us to use the same formulas to cover Labor Day protests. We make some tweaks to the way that we count people. So what we do is that we have a large spreadsheet, which I'm happy to share with you, and you're very welcome to cite any numbers with attribution to me and to Elliott and to the Xylem, where we ask various people who attended these protests or people who have seen social media coverage of these protests or news coverage of these protests to submit links and counts of how it has gone for their own communities. And because humans are actually very bad scientifically at counting people, a lot of the times people often over-exaggerate the number of people that are attending to protests with them, and there is sometimes also confirmation bias. As a result, we try to be as fair as possible in terms of using estimates. The way we use estimates, it's a lot of math and a lot of science behind itself, but we generally follow the rules that are being set by the crowd counting consortium that is based at Harvard University and the University of Connecticut. When there are reports of dozens of people attending a protest, we put a placeholder, which is 24, as you can see in Albemarle in North Carolina. When there are hundreds of people attending a protest, we put a placeholder, which is 201, as you can see in Ames, Iowa. For thousands of people, we put a placeholder of 2001. And for tens of thousands of people, which I don't think happened this time, we put a placeholder of 20,001. We are trying to use a very conservative estimate because hundreds of people can be 900 people, can be 300 people, but saying that it is 201 allows us to be more conservative in our estimate, that we don't over exaggerate what's happening on the ground. And we also use this placeholder, so when more information comes in, either from organizers or police estimates, we are able to revise the figures upward or downward. We've been observing very much that organizers and sometimes certain news outlets tend to overestimate or have a very high count of protester counts. But for police official estimates, the number is usually on the lower end. And that's because of, different ways of counting and also different motivations. And so what we usually do is we encourage people to submit different ways that They can have documented proof, whether it's visual proof, video proof, and we count the people inside the videos themselves, or we allow them to take an average. So to take an average and find, the middle ground of what that size could be. So as you can see in the green columns, that is what, our various volunteers and readers have submitted to the Xylem. And the left column, it is gray, which is the cleanup data. We try to find, a middle ground in terms of these estimates that lean towards the conservative side. And all of this work, I led a lot of the data gathering and also the data cleaning up, but it would not have been possible if not for a dedicated group of volunteers, chief of which is Sam Barnes, that is based in Atlanta. They are a journalist and researcher, and also Acorn Baden, who is in this chat, by the way, who is one of the organizers, and they founded the Recount Project, which also allows organizers to have a centralized location to submit various protest counts and state very clearly how they conducted this count to provide more context for journalists, for civic organizations, and also for researchers to verify this information. So in this kind of coverage, because the Xylem does national coverage, we have very small staff, and we are not able to send anyone to cover protests in person. It is important that we work a lot with various readers, concerned citizens, to essentially be our eyes and ears to get to as close as we can of how things have occurred. And in terms of the estimates that we are about to review, I will briefly talk about how we got to these estimates and also the numbers and why they're very significant. So this is a crowd counting consortium. It is a very helpful resource if you like to cover protests or rallies of any kind. We intend, after we finalize some of the information that we gather at the Xylem and from various news outlets, a number of them are with the Institute for Nonprofit News and the Alliance with Nonprofit News Outlets. We'll gather this data and submit it to the crowd counting consortium as a way for supporting future scholarly research. So we are estimating that across the US on Labor Day, around 150,000 people to 311,000 people have attended Workers Over Billionaires protest on Labor Day. These are events that are mostly people. They could be waving signs, or honking at an intersection. It could be people marching. It could be a rally at a fixed location, such as a park where there are guests and speakers. And we also count virtual events, recognizing that there are people with various disabilities who are not able to attend various protests, but they wish to express that they are passionate about various issues. So the way that we make this estimate is by taking what we call a median count and a upper limit count. So the median count is the smaller number, which is around 150,000 people. The way we do this is to collect all the events that we already have and to take the median number of all the counts of the events we had so far and estimate and multiply that by all the events that we haven't had data come in yet. And for our upper limit count, the way that we come to this number is to first add up all the numbers of people that we've already counted across all the various protests, and then we take the average instead of the median of all those protests, and then multiply the average by all the events that we don't have data yet or we haven't counted. As of this morning, while organizers claim that there were roughly around 1,000 events happening across all 50 states, we've only received data from approximately a quarter of these events, so around 250 events. And a lot of these counts were quite fake, to be honest. They were described in the dozens and the hundreds. So we used a lot of placeholders, but we are at least able to verify that such protests existed. They actually happened. And as more and more data come in, which we assume will happen over today and tomorrow, the differences between the two numbers, which is 150,000 and 311,000, will slowly shrink because we have more clarity over how many people who have attended. So to give a sense of how many people, the large amount of people that have attended this protest, here is a Wikipedia table of some of the largest protests and rallies that have ever happened in the United States. So the ones that are in yellow are nationwide protests, and the ones that are in black and white are local protests that happens in a specific city. And given the number of around 150,000 to 311,000, the Xylem is currently estimating that this protest on Labor Day is roughly one of the 25 largest protest events in American history. So it is roughly on par with the Tea Party Tax Day protest in the Obama era, and also in terms of raw numbers, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom during the Civil Rights Movement in Washington, D.C. So one thing we do want to caution here is that a lot of these estimates that have been for past protests are also very rough. So we're trying our best to be as specific as possible so we can offer a little bit more confidence in the numbers that we are offering. And this could be used for future news reporting or to compare different events. So there are a few things that I want to talk about in terms of limitations of the work that we do. The first thing that is really important is that our reporting really depends on reader submissions and things that are happening on the ground. And if nobody submits information in terms of how many people showed up in the protest in their town, we are unable to give a good estimate of the number of people attending nationwide, because it is a model that considers how different cities across the US and different towns in the US have responded. And in the particular case of this protest, there are a few things that really hampered how we could get to an accurate count. First, there is much less news coverage of the Labor Day protest compared to No King's Day protest. A brief Google search revealed that there are maybe less than 10 news outlets that are able to give an accurate estimate that is not just dozens or not just hundreds in the news reports compared to news reports in June when No King's Day protests happened. Another reason why this number appears to be much smaller than the No King's Day protest, which estimated 3 to 5 million people attended, is because it's in the Labor Day holiday weekend. And it is important to recognize that, a lot of people are taking their time off to spend with their family, or they might be out of country, which is because we're still at a very tail end of the summer, which is possible reasons why the attendance numbers are very different from the last time we covered No King's Day. There's also a reasonable fear of retaliation or consequences for various Americans attending the protest. In our case in Atlanta, for example, during the No King's Day protest, one of our city's independent reporters, his name is Mario Guevara, an El Salvadorian, was detained by local police and handed over to ICE, where he is currently detained somewhere in southeastern Georgia. He is the only journalist who is currently jailed by law enforcement for doing his job, which is covering protest. Mario Guevara's situation is known nationwide, and many journalistic organizations in Georgia, in Atlanta, and also across the US and across the world have spoken up in support of him. But this also underscores the risk of attending or covering protests, as immigrants in particular who have been really affected by such policies might be concerned that they might be cornered, they might be harassed, or they might expose themselves to political risk that they cannot bear, which might be a deterrent of why people are not attending. However, in order to really prove what we've been observing anecdotally requires a lot of work from our colleagues, reporters, and also from various academic groups to really do in-depth writing and reporting and interviewing of protest attendees or people who used to attend protests but no longer attend protests to understand whether that's the case or not. So here are some sights and sounds from all the protests that the Xylem has covered in this year. So as a lot of the protest signs are, in terms of the science protests that we're covering, a lot of the protest signs are directed towards the CDC, towards various environmental groups, and specifically towards President Donald Trump, Elon Musk, who once led DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and also Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. That's because they have the most decision-making power in terms of environmental health policy, and also because they've been some of the most prominent public figures that have been distributing disinformation and false statements about America's public health, about America's environmental policy, about the people who do such work on a national platform. So all of these photos, I took them while covering protests. For example, there's the "Please Don't Kill Us" CDC Sign to Save Live protest sign. There's Sign Saves. There's Atlanta Loves CDC. There were also a lot of more humorous and sometimes not suitable for work or presentation protest signs. Some of them are, for example, about transgenic mice, which is a satire of some public figures describing confusing transgender folks from transgenic mice. Transgenic mice means their genes are being altered in order to conduct an experiment, but because the word has trans in it, it was flagged by an AI system which rejected or erased these words from federal databases. There's also a lot of satire which essentially acts as insults towards the president or the Health and Human Services Secretary or towards some of local officials. And a lot of people essentially use paper signs or huge banners and showing up. As far as our coverage goes, we haven't seen a lot of chalking. We haven't seen, like a car parade yet, but that might be our experience covering the cities that, our reporters are in, which are, Atlanta, Seattle, and New York. That could be different across different parts of the US, for example, in a smaller town or at a highway overpass. And so we want to encourage more news outlets to join the effort to have a fuller reporting of what people are actually saying and thinking in these protests, and giving an appropriate amount of coverage that reflects our readers, who are our constituents, like biggest concerns and needs. So here are some trends and outliers that we are starting to observe now that I've covered four protests. One of the first most interesting thing that I've noticed is the amount of public official participation that's very different across various cities and states. For example, in Monday's protest, right? In certain large cities, the mayors are the leaders of the protest. For example, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, or in Boston, the Mayor Wu and also the Governor Healy have been very active. And even in certain cases, in Los Angeles cases, the Mayor Karen Bass has showed up unannounced to protest against immigration enforcement. However, that is very different in terms of blue cities in blue states compared to, for example, blue cities in competitive states or red states. In Atlanta, one very notable thing that we observed was that no public official in the city level participated in any protests of any size. So Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens, as well as city council members, all of which are running for re-election in November, by the way, which means they're in re-election season, they may be facing challenges from the left and right. They have all declined to attend any kind of protest or to speak at any kind of protest. And interestingly, in Atlanta's case, a lot of officials representing more suburban areas or more outer edge areas of the metro area showed up to these protests instead. For example, in addition to State Senator Jason Esefes, who represents the northern suburbs and also a small slice of northern Atlanta. Other people who have attended include State Senator Josh McLaurin, who is running for lieutenant governor. And in past protests, we've also seen people such as, a state representative that represents the diverse suburbs of Atlanta. And this is a very interesting trend we're noticing. And we love to work with news outlets to understand why are certain public officials more willing to participate in mass protests than others, and whether that has anything to do with, the public officials of their race, of their ethnicity, of their political positions, whether they're running for re-election or not, and also how they have approached their relationship with their state level officials. Some trends and outliers we also mentioned, before was media coverage. Media coverage has been sparse over this weekend, and we want to understand why that is so, and how news outlets make decisions as to what protests they cover and what protests they not cover. And we want to learn from one another in terms of news media, in terms of what counts as newsworthy. For the Xylem, the reason why pro-science and pro-democracy protests are newsworthy is very clear, as I've articulated in the beginning of this news event. But we want to ensure that as many news media outlets have a consistent position as well and have the manpower to do this. As more protests keep going on, we want to start measuring whether long weekends or holidays have an effect on participant levels and also the ways they participate. And finally, we want to start understanding the age and race and professions of the participants of various rallies across the US. From my personal observation, and as the photos that you just seen have revealed, a lot of the participants appear to be older, appear to be more white, and appear to be more female. And why is that so? Is it because they prefer this particular way of civic action? What about young people? The Xylem's readership is around, 50% to 60% between the ages of 18 and 34. How are young people, why are young people not participating in these protests to the same degree that their parents or their grandparents are? And if they're not participating in said protests, what other ways are they doing to, respond to this, to Trump 2.0? What are the other ways that they're making a difference in terms of science, health, environmental policy? This is something that we want to continue covering. And we've also heard in a few cases where there are overseas protests that are in solidarity with protests that are happening in the continental United States. We've heard such cases in Germany, and also in places where either there are American expats or whether in countries that have traditionally have warm relations with the United States, where residents are just simply expressing their support for protesters in the United States. And as we cover global issues at the Xylem, it is important to understand how these global movements converge with one another. When I grew up in Hong Kong, there were protest movements that also spread to various cities across the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, for example. And we want to understand why people feel that it was important to show solidarity to the events happening in the US. Maybe they are people who've been positively affected by US policy in the past, or been negatively affected by current or past policy, and they wanted to express that. We want to start to build this cross-border reporting of how people across the world are responding to this democratic backsliding in the US and assault on whether it's regulatory or financial or political support towards sound science and towards science and health policy. So in conclusion, this is the first steps of the Xylem in taking the lead to report protests as a science. And to be honest, there's still a lot of uncertainty, and there's still a lot of, things that we are still learning how to do this. And it is important to recognize that, the United States is a very, very large country with a lot of things happening at once, and people are stretched thin in different ways. And so we are trying to figure out how to work with different civic groups to do the best reporting that we can, that is fair, that is accurate, that is truthful. And we would love for you to be able to participate in this effort. So I posted in two links in the chat. So there's a free newsletter from the Xylem that you can subscribe for more information as we continue to update these numbers, or we will send you updated coverage about various impacts on environmental health across the world that has some relation to you and what you can do about it. We are also hiring a managing editor full-time. Our managing editor last year has been very supportive of my work, and that's why I've been able to have the time to do all this data crunching, all this data cleaning up, and working with various volunteers over the Labor Day weekend. So if you are able, please consider chipping in a few dollars to help us hire her full-time so we can offer more support towards our staff reporters, towards our correspondents that are on the ground covering these protests or breaking news events, or doing investigative work on certain on the stakes and consequences of groups that have been traditionally been neglected from the news. Please consider giving some money to help support us continue doing this work. And now I will open up the time for questions. Feel free, if you have any tips, comments, or suggestions, put it in the chat or Q&A, or you can also directly message me on Blue Sky, Instagram, LinkedIn, or even Signal, so we can continue this conversation and help us do the best journalism that we can offer. So thank you for taking this time to attend this news webinar, and we will open up the time for questions. So I saw the comment from Kala. Thank you so much for your praise. And I just opened the ability for our attendees to ask questions and unmute themselves because we have a smaller attendance this time. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask any question. I'm happy to either go deeper or go broader according to the questions that you ask. Yes, so Kala just asked, can we share some of the data we have about protests in cities? So before I do that, I want to first share the raw data that we have. So this data is publicly available, and you can bookmark this and send it to your colleagues as well. All right, here we go. So one of the biggest reasons why we have such an uncertainty in terms of our protest estimates is because we don't have good data from cities. In terms of all the cities that have given any kind of useful data for the Xylem's purposes, the only ones that have done so are Albuquerque, Austin, Texas, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and and I think San Diego. So most of the large cities in the US, I think, in terms of LA, in terms of New York City, in terms of, Atlanta, for example, Miami, or, large cities in Texas like Dallas or Houston, Oklahoma City, Denver, a lot of these data is not as accurate as we hope to be. And that's why there's a huge amount of uncertainty in our estimates. Because as far as we are aware, like even for the No King State protest, for example, tens of thousands of people showed up, and sometimes even to hundreds of thousands of people showing up in a single protest somewhere. And so it is very difficult to compare that kind of number with quote unquote hundreds or thousands. So we decided we'd rather take the more conservative approach to things. And we are aware that organizers are beginning to, realize the same issue when it comes to counting crowds in cities. And I've seen in particular one group in San Diego have actually published a basically a preprint of explaining the methodology towards estimating using drone footage and AI models. So the way that they do it is that if they have a park, they physically measure the boundaries. So how many yards is this park on one end and the other, and then they use a grid to count the number of people in a small section, and they take different samples of overhead drone photos, and they try to multiply it and give a good estimate. For this one example, we're still going back to verify what they suggested, but they suggested in San Diego at one point there were around 10,000 people attending a protest, which is a much different number from what local TV media is estimating, which is around 2,000 or 3,000 people. And in the San Diego Union Tribune, they were estimating maybe 1,500 people. So when the people who attend cities or attend the crowds larger, the more uncertainty that happens in counting and in estimating. And unfortunately, as of what we currently have in data, it's really, really fuzzy. And that's why, we try our best to keep doing this reporting. So the more people know about it, the more they can take action to accurately count their own protests, or to invent new ways to more scientifically or more quantitatively measure the number of people who are participating in protests. And at some point, I'll be interested in reporting about how people count about protests, as one of the follow-up stories that the Xylem wants to do, and seeing how people use creative ways to count could also have other implications for scientific research. For example, counting trees or using AI models to count things in general. So I hope that answers your question, Cal. Any more questions, comments, suggestions that we have here? All right. So as you see, we don't have new questions or comments or chats. So I will give everybody 7 minutes of their time back. Thank you so much for attending our first news event. And we will be having our next news event in the first week of October. So our monthly events happen while we are, usually the first Monday of each month at 11 a.m. We're still trying to figure out what times work best for our audiences, because we recognize people show up to various, they have work commitments or they have various academic commitments. So we're also trying to figure out times that work the best for everyone. So feel free to, offer any feedback and suggestions. Have a great day, everyone.